There's a reason revolutions feel impossible, right up until the moment they're inevitable. The people inside the system can't imagine the ground giving way beneath them, because the ground has always held. The courts are there. The flag is there. The police are there. The currency still buys groceries. The trains still run. And so a nation tells itself the same bedtime story every powerful nation tells. We're too advanced, too modern, too stable for history to do to us what it did to everyone else. But history doesn't care about confidence. History cares about pressure. Across the last 2.5 centuries, different countries with different cultures, different ideologies, and different levels of development have collapsed into the same sequence. France in the late 18th century. Russia in the early 20th. Cuba in the mid-20th. Not identical in details, but eerily similar in rhythm. First, the gap between the top and everyone else becomes not merely large, but humiliating, visible in daily life, impossible to ignore. Then the state begins to look less like a referee and more like an agent for the winners. Corruption, incompetence, or simple indifference become a feature, not a bug. Next, the people who usually keep a system stable, the educated, the working middle, the professionals who assume the future would be better than the past, stop feeling protected by the rules. Their expectations rise, their reality falls, and that mismatch turns into anger with a direction. And then comes the stage that matters most, the loss of faith in institutions. Not the loss of faith in a politician. Not the loss of faith in a party. The loss of faith in the idea that the system can correct itself. That elections are legitimate. That courts are neutral. That law enforcement is fair. That the media is honest. That the game, even if brutal, is at least real. When people no longer believe the system can be reformed from within, they don't look for policy tweaks. They look for an exit, and if the exit is blocked, they look for a match. A revolution is not a protest. It's not a riot. It's not even a dramatic election. A revolution is when the existing order is destroyed and replaced by something new, often something harsher than what came before. That's the cruel twist. The momentum that breaks a broken system can also clear the path for extremists, purges, and new forms of control. The slogans promise liberation. The math, more often than anyone wants to admit, delivers chaos. So when someone says a country is at stage 4, they're not saying collapse is guaranteed on a schedule. They're saying the guardrails are failing, the shared reality is cracking, and the next stages can arrive faster than people expect, especially if an economic shock, a contested moment of power, or a single catalytic incident turns simmering grievance into mass alignment. The question isn't whether a nation believes it's exceptional. The question is whether it has rebuilt trust before the countdown becomes a stampede. To understand why stage 4 is so dangerous, you have to see how this cycle actually begins. Not at the moment of violence, but decades earlier, when inequality quietly hardens into structure. Every major revolution that appears sudden is, in reality, the delayed consequence of pressures that were allowed to compound without release. In late 18th century France, the country was not collapsing on the surface. Paris was the cultural capital of Europe. French was the language of diplomacy. Art, science, philosophy flourished. But the economy beneath that elegance had become grotesquely unbalanced. A tiny elite-controlled land, privilege, and exemption from sacrifice, while the overwhelming majority carried the fiscal weight of the state. What mattered was not simply that the poor were poor, but that the inequality was visible, ritualized, and legally protected. When bread prices spiked after bad harvests, peasants spent nearly everything just to survive, while the nobility continued banquets at Versailles. The contrast wasn't abstract. It was daily humiliation. Russia followed the same pattern a century later. The empire spanned continents, commanded armies, and projected strength, yet the social structure remained medieval. The nobility owned nearly everything. The peasants owned nothing but obligation. Even after serfdom ended, economic freedom never arrived. Urban workers labored in factories under conditions closer to feudalism than modern industry. The state did not merely fail to correct the imbalance, it defended it. When hardship deepened during war, the regime revealed not resilience but brittleness. Cuba's case is even more instructive, because it destroys the myth that revolutions only emerge from backward or impoverished societies. In the 1950s, Cuba had functioning infrastructure, tourism, and rising incomes in its cities. But wealth was geographically and politically concentrated. Rural regions were stripped of opportunity. Profits flowed outward or upward, never back into communities. Corruption wasn't hidden. It was openly transactional. The state existed as a private revenue machine for those at the top. This is why inequality alone does not trigger revolution. Inequality is ancient. What triggers revolution is inequality, combined with perceived illegitimacy. When people believe the system is unfair but reformable, they endure. When they believe it is unfair and rigged beyond repair, endurance turns into defiance. That transition accelerates when government responses fail. In France, the monarchy borrowed instead of reforming. In Russia, the Tsar doubled down on divine authority while the army collapsed. In Cuba, Batista ruled through force, canceling elections and silencing opposition. Each regime responded to crisis not by restoring trust, but by exposing its own incompetence or moral emptiness. The crucial moment comes when the middle class crosses a psychological line. Revolutions are not launched by the poorest citizens, who are often too exhausted to organize. They are launched when professionals, merchants, students, lawyers, engineers, and soldiers decide the system no longer rewards loyalty. These are the people who understand how institutions work. When they withdraw consent, legitimacy evaporates fast. Once that consent is gone, institutions stop functioning as stabilizers. Courts become symbols. Elections become theater. Police become political actors. The state may still exist physically, but it no longer exists morally. That is stage 4. And history shows that, once a society reaches this point, events compress. Years of slow decay give way to months of cascading failure. This is why revolutions always shock the elites. From inside power, collapse looks impossible until the day it arrives. From outside power, it feels overdue. The danger of stage 4 is not that violence has begun, but that restraint has lost its authority. And once restraint disappears, the clock no longer moves at human speed. Stage 3 is where revolutions become mathematically possible, but stage 4 is where they become politically unstoppable. The difference is subtle, and it's why governments consistently misread the danger. They count protesters. They measure approval ratings. They watch elections. What they fail to measure is belief. Once belief collapses, power becomes performative. In every historical case, the loss of faith in institutions did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived as erosion, small failures that went unanswered, obvious contradictions that were never resolved, rules applied selectively, punishments that felt arbitrary. Over time, the public stopped asking whether the system was fair and began asking whether it was real at all. In revolutionary France, the monarchy still existed, but it no longer commanded moral authority. The Estates General was meant to legitimize new taxes. Instead, it exposed how little representation actually existed. When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, the act was revolutionary not because of violence, but because of symbolism. It said, openly, that existing institutions no longer represented reality. From that moment forward, every royal decree felt hollow. Power had not yet fallen, but it had been stripped of credibility. Russia followed the same path at terrifying speed. After the Tsar abdicated, the provisional government inherited authority without legitimacy. On paper, it was lawful. In practice, it satisfied no one. It promised reform but delivered continuation. It spoke of democracy while keeping a disastrous war alive. Soldiers, workers, and citizens watched the gap between rhetoric and reality widen by the day. When institutions fail to act decisively in crisis, they do not appear moderate. They appear fraudulent. Cuba's institutional collapse was quieter but just as fatal. Elections existed, but no one believed in them. Courts existed, but justice was purchasable. Police existed, but fear governed their use. By the time Castro's movement gained traction, the state had already lost the argument. Batista did not fall because Castro was brilliant. He fell because almost no one believed the system was worth defending. This is the heart of stage 4. Institutions stop functioning as shared arbiters of truth and order. Instead, they are reinterpreted through tribal lenses. Courts are no longer courts. They are weapons. Media is no longer media. It is propaganda. Law enforcement is no longer neutral. It is either an enemy or a shield, depending on allegiance. When this happens, a society loses its common language. Without a common language, compromise becomes betrayal. And without compromise, escalation becomes inevitable. This stage is particularly dangerous because it produces a paradox. The state may still look powerful. It still collects taxes. It still deploys police. It still passes laws. But every action accelerates distrust. Enforcement breeds resentment. Silence breeds conspiracy. Transparency breeds disbelief. At this point, even good faith reforms fail, because there is no longer agreement on what good faith looks like. Historically, this is where moderates lose control. People who once argued for reform are drowned out by those offering certainty. Extremists thrive in institutional vacuum because they provide simple narratives in a world that feels incoherent. They name enemies. They promise justice without complexity. They offer belonging instead of process. In France, this vacuum empowered radical clubs, like the Jacobins. In Russia, it allowed the Bolsheviks to position themselves as the only force willing to act. In Cuba, it transformed a small guerrilla movement into a national alternative. The common thread was not ideology. It was legitimacy. When legitimacy dies, whoever appears decisive inherits momentum. Stage 4 does not mean collapse is unavoidable. But it means prevention becomes exponentially harder. Fixes that once required policy now require belief. And belief, once broken, cannot be legislated back into existence. It must be rebuilt through trust, sacrifice, and visible fairness. History shows that very few governments manage that in time. This is why revolutions feel sudden. They are not sudden at all. They are the final release of pressure after belief has already evacuated the system. Violence does not create collapse. Collapse creates permission for violence. And once that permission spreads, the system's fate is no longer decided by elections or speeches, but by which forces are organized, disciplined, and willing to act. Once a society enters stage 4, the question is no longer whether revolutionary forces exist, but whether they can organize faster than the system can restore legitimacy. This is the phase where history accelerates, because the old order is still standing, but its authority is hollow. And hollow systems do not collapse slowly. They shatter when stressed. What follows is the rise of movements that promise resolution instead of process. In France, the early revolutionaries spoke the language of rights and reform. But as food shortages continued and fear spread, patience evaporated. Moderation came to be seen not as wisdom, but as weakness. The Jacobins did not win because their ideas were better argued. They won because they were clearer, harsher, and more decisive, in a moment when decisiveness mattered more than nuance. They offered moral certainty in a world that felt unmoored. Russia's trajectory was even more compressed. After the Tsar's abdication, the provisional government believed legitimacy could be earned through procedure. Elections, committees, deliberation. But the population was no longer evaluating legitimacy through rules. They were evaluating it through outcomes. Food, peace, stability. The Bolsheviks understood this. Their promises were simple to the point of brutality. End the war, seize land, feed the cities. Whether those promises were realistic mattered less than the fact that they acknowledged reality. When people feel desperate, complexity feels like deception. Cuba reveals another critical dynamic of this stage: the role of state violence. Batista's regime attempted to preserve order through repression. But repression without legitimacy is self-defeating. Each raid, each torture, each disappeared student did not strengthen the state. It recruited against it. Violence became proof that the system had nothing left to offer except fear. By the time the revolutionary movement gained mass support, the regime's security forces were no longer a stabilizing force. They were a liability. This is the moment when Stage 5 begins to form, even if it is not fully visible yet. Revolutionary movements do not need majority support at first. They need momentum, narrative control, and the perception that history is moving with them. Once enough people believe the old system is already finished, defending it feels pointless. Neutrality collapses. Fence-sitters choose sides, not out of ideology, but out of survival instinct. At this stage, economic stress acts as an accelerant. Inflation, unemployment, debt crises, or shortages turn abstract grievances into immediate pain. In France, bread prices transformed political theory into hunger. In Russia, military defeat turned loyalty into mutiny. In Cuba, Economic stagnation and rural poverty turned resentment into rebellion. Economic pressure does not cause revolution by itself, but it decides timing. It determines when fear overwhelms restraint. Another hallmark of this phase is institutional fracture. Police forces, militaries, and bureaucracies stop behaving as unified entities. Individuals within them begin making personal calculations. Is the regime likely to survive? Will following orders protect me, or endanger me later? When loyalty becomes risky, fragmentation begins. History shows that no government survives once its coercive apparatus loses coherence. This is why elites are consistently blindsided. From the top, everything still looks intact. Laws exist. Budgets pass. Security forces deploy. But power has already shifted psychologically. Authority no longer flows downward. It is contested at every level. Orders require persuasion. Enforcement requires justification. And justification is no longer trusted. By the time revolutionary movements openly gain mass support, the outcome is often already decided. The visible surge is not the beginning. It is the confirmation that the social contract has dissolved. What replaces it will depend not on ideals, but on which groups are most disciplined, most ruthless, and most prepared to exploit the vacuum. History's cruel lesson is that Stage 4 is the last off-ramp before events escape control. After this point, attempts at reform tend to arrive too late or appear insincere. Trust cannot be rebuilt at the speed panic spreads. And once panic aligns with organization, the system enters a phase where outcomes are driven less by intention and more by inertia. This is why Stage 5 and 6 arrive faster than anyone expects. The groundwork has already been laid. The only remaining variable is the trigger. Stage 5 is the moment when abstract danger becomes visible power. This is when revolutionary movements stop feeling fringe and start feeling inevitable. Not because they suddenly convince everyone, but because enough people conclude that the existing system cannot survive. At that point, belief shifts not toward a better future, but toward the least uncertain option. And in times of collapse, certainty is intoxicating. History shows that Stage 5 is not driven by ideology. It is driven by exhaustion. People do not rally to revolutionary movements because they have studied their doctrines. They rally because the present has become intolerable and the future offered by the system feels fake. In France, radical factions gain traction not by offering detailed governance plans, but by promising punishment for enemies and relief from hunger. In Russia, the Bolsheviks did not win debates. They won by promising to end a war that was consuming lives for no gain. In Cuba, Castro's movement succeeded because Batista's regime had lost all moral standing, not because communism was widely desired. What unites these cases is narrative compression. Revolutionary movements reduce complex crises into simple moral equations: us versus them, justice versus corruption, people versus elites. This simplification is not accidental. It is necessary. When institutions have collapsed, complexity feels like evasion. People want clarity, even if that clarity is false. This is also the stage where moderates disappear. Reformers who once argued for gradual change are now distrusted by everyone. To the establishment, they are traitors. To revolutionaries, they are collaborators. In France, moderates were guillotined alongside nobles. In Russia, non-Bolshevik socialists were purged. In Cuba, early allies who expected democracy were silenced or exiled. Revolutions do not reward nuance. They punish it. As mass support builds, the balance of fear flips. Earlier in the cycle, the public fears the state. In Stage 5, the state begins to fear the public. Police hesitate. Soldiers question orders. Bureaucrats stall. Each act of hesitation feeds the perception that the regime is finished, and perception becomes reality faster than force can correct it. This phase is also marked by moral escalation. Revolutionary movements frame violence as necessity. First against symbols of the old order, then against alleged conspirators, then against insufficiently loyal allies. Each escalation is justified as temporary. Each becomes permanent. Once blood has been spilled, compromise becomes impossible, because compromise would require accountability, and accountability threatens survival. Economically, Stage 5 is devastating. Investment halts, capital flees, supply chains fracture. The very dysfunction that fueled revolution now intensifies because the system can no longer coordinate responses. Inflation accelerates. Shortages multiply. These failures are blamed on sabotage, enemies, or foreign interference, further reinforcing the revolutionary narrative. Reality becomes indistinguishable from propaganda, not because truth disappears, but because no authority remains to enforce it. This is where history's most persistent illusion takes hold. The belief that once the old regime is removed, stability will return. In reality, Stage 5 is only the doorway to Stage 6. The collapse of the old order does not resolve pressure. It releases it. Power vacuums do not remain empty. They are filled by those willing to use force without restraint. Every revolution examined follows this pattern. The movement that topples the regime is rarely the one best suited to govern. It is the one best suited to destroy. Discipline replaces legitimacy. Fear replaces trust. And the new system justifies its failures by invoking the enemies it claims to have defeated. This is why revolutions so often devour their own supporters. The anger that unites people against a corrupt system does not disappear when that system falls. It turns inward. New hierarchies form, new elites emerge, and the promises that mobilized millions become dangerous liabilities, because fulfilling them would require resources, stability, and patience that no longer exist. Stage 5 feels like victory to those inside it. History records it as the point of no return. Once mass support aligns with organized radical movements, outcomes are no longer shaped by intention, but by momentum. The system has lost its ability to negotiate its way out. From here, collapse is not a possibility. It is a process. Stage 6 is where the fantasy of revolution collides with the physics of power. This is the phase people imagine least accurately, because it is almost never what the slogans promised. The old regime is gone, but what replaces it is not clarity, justice, or renewal. It is fragmentation, fear, and a brutal competition to control what remains. In France, the monarchy fell, but stability did not arrive. Instead, the state dissolved into paranoia. The revolution that began with declarations of rights quickly transformed into a machinery of accusation. The guillotine did not target only nobles. It consumed moderates, allies, and eventually, the revolutionaries themselves. Violence became self-justifying. The terror was framed as purification. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to impose order on a society that no longer trusted anything but force. Russia followed a similar trajectory, only on a larger scale. The Bolsheviks seized power quickly, but governing a collapsed empire required terror as policy. Civil war was not an accident. It was the natural outcome of a system where no shared legitimacy existed. Entire regions rebelled. Foreign powers intervened. The economy imploded. To survive, the new regime centralized authority, crushed dissent, and normalized mass death. The revolution promised peace and bread. It delivered famine, surveillance, and one of the most repressive systems in history. Cuba's Stage 6 unfolded more slowly, but the logic was the same. Castro entered Havana as a liberator. Within months, opposition was criminalized. Independent media vanished. Elections became symbolic. Property was seized. Those who had supported the revolution because they hated Batista discovered that the new system tolerated even less dissent. Stability returned only in the form of stagnation and fear. The revolution succeeded in destroying the old order, but it replaced corruption with permanent control. The defining feature of Stage 6 is not chaos alone. It is the consolidation of power under extraordinary conditions. Revolutions fracture societies, but they also create the justification for absolute authority. Emergency becomes permanent. Surveillance becomes necessary. Violence becomes normalized. The argument is always the same. The revolution is under threat. Therefore, freedom must wait. Economically, Stage 6 is catastrophic. Capital does not return quickly to countries that have proven property. Contracts and law are conditional. Skilled workers flee if they can. Supply chains break. Innovation collapses. The economy shifts from creation to survival. Scarcity becomes political. Access to food, housing, and safety is mediated by loyalty. This is not accidental. Control thrives on dependence. What makes Stage 6 especially dangerous is that it rewrites memory. The failures of the new system are blamed on the old one, or on enemies real and imagined. The public is told that conditions are bad not because of current decisions, but because of sabotage, legacy corruption, or external hostility. Over time, the population forgets what normal stability felt like. Fear becomes baseline. Survival becomes success. This is the end state the revolution cycle produces most reliably. Not freedom, but managed despair. Not equality, but a new hierarchy justified by ideology instead of tradition. And once this stage is reached, reversal is extraordinarily difficult. Systems born in violence are defended by violence. Leaders who rise through revolution cannot allow pluralism, because pluralism threatens their origin story. History's warning is not that every society at stage 4 must reach stage 6. It is that once stage 5 begins, stage 6 almost always follows. Preventing it requires something rare. Institutions willing to reform before legitimacy collapses. Elites willing to sacrifice before fear turns into rage. And populations willing to tolerate slow repair instead of explosive revenge. Most societies fail that test, not because they are evil, but because they wait too long. The most uncomfortable lesson of the revolution cycle is not that collapse is possible, but that it is preventable only long before it feels urgent. By the time a society reaches stage 4, the tools that once maintained stability no longer work. Trust cannot be ordered back into existence. Legitimacy cannot be legislated. And fear does not respond to reasoned speeches. History does not say that countries inevitably fall into revolution. It says that countries that ignore the same warnings, in the same order, tend to repeat the same outcomes. France believed its monarchy was eternal. Russia believed its empire was sacred. Cuba believed prosperity insulated it from collapse. All were wrong, not because they were weak, but because they mistook durability for legitimacy. The United States sits at this exact inflection point. The warning signs are not hidden. Wealth concentration has reached levels historically associated with pre-revolutionary societies. Institutions once trusted across political lines are now viewed as partisan weapons. Large segments of the population believe the system no longer responds to peaceful pressure. That belief, more than any statistic, defines stage 4. What comes next is not predetermined, but it is constrained. Societies do not leap directly from dysfunction to renewal. They pass through organization, radicalization, and confrontation. If reform arrives late, it is interpreted as manipulation. If authority asserts itself forcefully, it confirms suspicion. And if nothing changes, the vacuum invites movements that promise certainty at the cost of pluralism. The hardest truth is that revolutions rarely deliver what their supporters imagine. They punish the corrupt, but they also destroy safeguards. They remove elites, but they replace them with enforcers. They promise dignity, but they normalize fear. The people who suffer most are almost never those who cause the collapse. They are the ones caught in between, navigating shortages, instability, and rules that change overnight. History does not offer optimism. It offers instruction. The past is not a prophecy, but it is a map of consequences. Stage 5 and 6 are not accidents. They are the outcome of systems that delayed correction until correction became impossible. Understanding this cycle does not require panic. It requires clarity. Revolutions are not born from a single election, a single protest, or a single crisis. They are born when enough people conclude that the future promised by the system will never arrive. Once that belief hardens, events move faster than intentions. The question is not whether a nation believes it is exceptional. Every nation does. The question is whether it is willing to act while belief still exists, before fear becomes the organizing principle of politics. Because once fear organizes society, history shows that it does not negotiate. It consumes. If you want to understand what happens when societies cross from stage 4 into stage 5, and why those transitions almost always surprise the people in power, stay with this channel. These patterns are not hidden. They are written, again and again, in the wreckage of the past.